Now, Aquinas will deal with the question of the existence of God in question 2 of the Prima Pars. So remember, this is the Summa Theologiae, the first out of 3 parts. And question 1 we read in the first module, and that had to do with the nature and scope of theology. It had 10 articles, and we read the first one. Why do we need theology beyond philosophy? Isn't philosophy, what is within natural reason, sufficient? And remember there in Article 1 of question 1, he answers that, Sacra Doctrina, revelation or theology, is necessary for the sake of our salvation, because we were made for an end that far surpasses our reason. So it must be revealed to us. Hence, we need revelation or theology reflecting on revelation. Having looked at what is theology and how does it happen, he then turns in question 2 to the idea of the existence of God. But he gives this prologue introduction as kind of a prologue to the beginning of all of his 600 plus questions to the Summa. And he says, because the chief aim of sacred doctrine is to teach the knowledge of God, not only as he is in himself, so wanting to understand God, but also as he is the beginning of things and their last end. So theology studies God and all things in relationship to God. God is the goal of all things, especially of rational creatures, as is clear from what has been already said. And therefore, in our endeavor to expound the science, we shall treat, and here he has his threefold delineation, the 3 major parts of the Summa. 1, of God, that's the Prima Pars. 2, Secunda Pars, of the rational creature's movement toward God, human activity, vice, virtue. And 3, the Tertia Pars of Christ, who as man is our way to God. So remember, everything ushers from God, exitus, from God, we get creation, and human being as the pinnacle of material creation returns back to God, reditus, through Jesus Christ. So prima, secunda, tertia pars. Now in treating God, there will be a threefold division. So that's 3 parts. This first part, the Prima Pars, is divided into 3 parts. First, he will consider whatever concerns the divine essence, the very being of God. And this is where we find the second question of the entire Summa on the existence of God. Okay, so I'm going to skip down. Concerning the divine essence, we must consider. And then he has another 3 points here. And the first point is whether God exists. Does God exist? So that's the first question. After that, he will look at how does God exist, the manner of God's existence, okay, or whatever concerns how God operates. So his activities, if he does indeed exist, and we know how he exists. But the main question here is the question of whether God exists. So it's question 2 of the Prima Pars. Now this question is divided into 3 articles, and that's what you read for class. So concerning the first, whether God exists, there are 3 points of inquiry. 1, whether the proposition God exists is self-evident. 2, whether it is demonstrable. And 3, whether God exists. Let me unpack this a little bit. He wants to examine whether God exists, but he's simply not going to walk in and say, yes, God exists. Rather, he will carefully reason out his manner of arguing that God does indeed exist. So first he will look at, is the proposition, this notion, God exists, is the notion itself self-evident? What do you think? Because that's the first article. That's what we do with here. And then on the next page, we'll see whether it's demonstrable. And then finally, the third article, as a culmination of this process, this linear process of reasoning, he will conclude or offer an answer to the question of whether God exists. Article 1, whether the existence of God is self-evident. What do you think? This proposition, God exists, do you think that that is self-evident? It's manifest in itself. Okay? What do you think Aquinas will say? Well, you might want to say, yes, it is self-evident that God exists. Aquinas will actually take the opposite position. And we see from the first objection, he says, it seems that the existence of God is self-evident. Remember, this is the objector speaking. Aquinas' position will be the opposite. For those things are said to be self-evident to us, the knowledge of which exists naturally in us. So the objector says, the knowledge of God's existence is in accord with our nature. We can know it by human reason alone. And the objector quotes St. John Damascene, who says the knowledge of God is naturally implanted in all. Therefore, the existence of God is self-evident. So that's the objector saying, yes, it is self-evident. That means that Aquinas will say no. The second objection is also a very interesting one. The objector says, further, those things are said to be self-evident, which are known as soon as the terms are known, which the philosopher says is true of the first principles of demonstration. So whenever we say that something is self-evident, what makes it self-evident? It is self-evident when we understand the terms. For example, when the nature of a whole and of a part is known, it is at once recognized that every whole is greater than a part. Okay, so if you understand what the word whole means, the complete thing, and you understand what the term or the word part means, it's not the whole, it's only a piece of the whole, it's a part. If you understand the words whole and part, then it is self-evident that the whole is greater than the part, right? That's obvious. If you understand the terms, mere reason will lead you to recognize what is self-evident. And he continues, but as soon as the signification of the name God is understood, remember this is the objector speaking, and he's saying that as soon as you understand the term or the word God, it is at once seen that God exists. So if you know that the understanding of God, then intrinsic or implicit in that understanding of the term is that he does exist. For by this name is signified that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Who said that? Yes, of course, you know, because we have just heard, this is directly quoting Anselm. So Aquinas, very interestingly here, is critiquing Anselm. He doesn't name him, but he is quoting Anselm as the position of objector 2. The second objection is Anselm's. And that's the whole idea that if we understand the terms, if we understand God as that which nothing greater can be conceived, then implicit in that understanding is the fact that God must indeed exist. He does exist. If he exists in my mind as the greatest possible thing conceivable, then it is conceivable that he actually exists not only in my mind, but also in reality. And Aquinas nicely sums up the argument here. But that which exists actually and mentally is greater than that which exists only mentally. Therefore, since as soon as the name God is understood, it exists mentally, it follows that it exists actually. Therefore, the proposition God exists is self-evident. There you have it, a great saint, great theologian, quoting another one and critiquing him. Very precise argumentation here. The third objection, let's go ahead and look at all of the objections. The third objection is actually another very good objection. We won't get into all of it, but let's simply acknowledge what the objection is. Further, the existence of truth is self-evident, for whoever denies the existence of truth grants that truth does not exist. And if truth does not exist, then the proposition truth does not exist is true. So suddenly, the proposition that truth does not exist is actually true in itself. That's self-contradictory. And if there is anything true, there must be truth. But God is truth. I am the way, the truth, and the life. Therefore, God exists is self-evident. How does Aquinas respond? In the second contra, he quotes scripture. And it's a very similar scripture passage to what Anselm quoted. So on the contrary, no one can mentally admit the opposite of what is self-evident. Right? So if it's self-evident, you can't deny it. As the philosopher states concerning the first principles of demonstration. But the opposite of the proposition God is can be mentally admitted. The fool said in his heart, there is no God. Now, if the fool can say this in his heart, it's not because he's renouncing his reason, but rather it's because it's not self-evident that God exists. If it were self-evident that God exists, then you simply could not deny it, in the same way that you cannot deny that the whole is greater than the part. Therefore, that God exists is not self-evident. Now, this is important for Aquinas and what he would do in Article 3, in the culmination of asking whether or not God exists. He must first show that the question, or the fact of God's existence, is not self-evident. Therefore, we have to use reason to argue towards the existence of God. He goes on to examine what is a proposition and how is it self-evident. So he says a proposition is self-evident because the predicate is included in the essence of the subject. So for example, if we make a statement, man is an animal, the subject is man, the predicate is an animal. Now the statement becomes obvious, becomes self-evident if the predicate is an animal, is a part of or within the subject. For an animal is contained in the essence of man, and indeed, man is an animal, it is self-evident because the notion of animal is implicit in man. When you understand what man is, this understanding of man involves the understanding of animal. Okay, so the predicate is included in the essence of the subject. If, therefore, the essence of the predicate and subject be known to all, the proposition will be self-evident to all. So if everyone knows what man is and what animal is, then this proposition becomes self-evident to everyone. As is clear with the example that he gave earlier, the whole is greater than the part. You know what a whole is, you know what a part is. If you know these two terms, then the proposition is self-evident. On the other hand, if, however, there are some to whom the essence of the predicate and subject is unknown, so if you only know one part, you only know either the predicate or the subject without knowing the other, then the proposition is not self-evident. Then the proposition will be self-evident in itself, but not to those who do not know the meaning of the predicate and subject of the proposition. Therefore, it happens, as Boethius says, that there are some notions of the mind which are common and self-evident only to the learned, as that incorporeal substances are not in space. Now, the proposition that he wants to assert, or wants to examine, is that God exists. What is the subject? It's God. What is the predicate? Exists. Do we understand these terms? Do we know what the word exist means? Yes, we do. Okay. Do we know what the term God means? No, we don't. Do we grasp the essence of God? We do not. And therefore, this is why this proposition is not self-evident to us. And this is why there are fools running around professing that there is no God, because their minds cannot wrap around the notion, the essence of God. It's impossible. So it's not obvious, it's not self-evident, at least to us, that God exists. However, does God know what it means to exist? Does God know the essence of God? Yes, he does. He's omniscient. He knows everything. Therefore, this proposition is self-evident in itself. It's self-evident to God, because God knows both principles. It's obvious to him that he exists, but it's not obvious to human beings. Okay? Therefore, I say that the proposition God exists of itself is self-evident, for the predicate is the same as the subject. Okay? When it comes to God, God exists, or God is the same as God. His existence is his very being. So if you've taken metaphysics, God's essay is his very self. God is his essay, his being. For the predicate is the same as the subject, because God is his own existence, as will hereafter be shown. Now, because we do not know the essence of God, the proposition is not self-evident to us, but needs to be demonstrated. Okay, so this is where he points us to the next article. We do not know God's existence by it being self-evident, but we can know it by demonstration. So here's the work of reason to demonstrate. Okay? But before we get to Articles 2 and 3, let's complete Article 1 by returning to the objections. So remember, the first objection was the fact that the knowledge of God's existence is natural to us. Okay? It belongs to our nature, and therefore, says the objector, it is self-evident. How does he respond to this? To know that God exists in a general and confused way is implanted in us by nature. Yes, it is in our nature, but it is in a very general and confused way. It is in our nature because God is our happiness. He's our end. It's written in our beings that we will find our happiness in God. So it's implicit within us, it's in our nature, but not in a fully manifest way. Rather, it's in a confused way. For man naturally desires happiness, and what is naturally desired by man is naturally known by him. This, however, is not to know absolutely. It's not to know with clarity, as something that is self-evident is known. Just as to know that someone is approaching is not the same as to know that it's Peter who is approaching. The second objection, remember, was given to us in the voice and the thought of Anselm. This idea that if you know the notion of God, then implicit in that definition of God is his very existence. And here again we have Aquinas' refutation of Anselm. Perhaps not everyone who hears the name God understands it to signify something than which nothing greater can be thought. Anselm thinks that people understand God as that which nothing greater can be thought, but Aquinas is saying not everyone will define God in this way. They see that some have believed God to be a body. So there are those who have worshipped statues or worshipped animals, God believing, professing faith that God is bodily. So that's a different understanding, a different definition of God. Yet, granted that everyone understands that by this name, God is signified, something than which nothing greater can be thought. Nevertheless, so he says, even if we conceded to Anselm's definition of God, even if everyone understood the term God to be that which nothing greater can be conceived, nevertheless, it does not therefore follow that he understands that what the name signifies actually exists, but only that it exists mentally. So Aquinas points out the error of Anselm. This definition for God is only a mental conception. It does not prove the reality. It does not actualize what is held in the mind. Okay. Nor can it be argued that it actually exists, unless it be admitted that there actually exists something than which nothing greater can be thought. You actually have to have this definition and hold to this definition in order for Anselm's argument to work. And there are plenty of people who do not define God in the same way, and this precisely is not admitted by those who hold that God does not exist. Okay, we won't do the third objection. Let's move then to Article 2. Now, having established that God exists is not a self-evident proposition, he's not going to despair of our coming to know that God exists, but rather he will say it's not obvious, but we can still, by the powers of reason, come to this knowledge through the work of demonstration. Okay, so to demonstrate is to follow a process of thought and demonstration from one premise to a conclusion. So can it be demonstrated that God exists? That's the question. And so from what I've said, you should all be nodding that yes, indeed. The objection. It seems that the existence of God cannot be demonstrated, for it is an article of faith that God exists. Now, how would you respond? Is this an article of faith, or does it rely on reason? We've already said it is a preamble of reason. But what is of faith cannot be demonstrated, because a demonstration produces scientific knowledge, whereas faith is of the unseen. Okay, so clearly, this has an erroneous notion. It fails to recognize the preambles of faith. Let's go directly to the respondio. I answer that demonstration can be made in two ways. So again, he distinguishes. There are two kinds of demonstrations. One is through cause and is called propter quid, according to the thing itself. One way to demonstrate is to demonstrate from the cause. And this is to argue from what is prior absolutely. So the cause comes first in an absolute way. But there's another way of proving a demonstration. The other is through the effect. And this is called a demonstration quia. It's through which. So you can demonstrate, you can prove something either by showing that the cause does exist. But if it comes to God, then you can't prove God because the cause is far beyond us. But we can reach a deductive knowledge of the cause through reasoning by demonstrating, starting in the effects. That's the second manner of demonstration. This is to argue from what is prior relatively only to us. Okay, so it's starting from our experience and looking at the effects and then reasoning from the effects to say there must be a cause to all of these effects. When an effect is better known to us than its cause, from the effect we proceed to the knowledge of the cause. And from every effect, the existence of its proper cause can be demonstrated, so long as its effects are better known to us. And that is the case with God. We know God's effects. Here I am, I exist, because God created me. I know myself more directly than I have knowledge of God. Right? So I am the effect of God, and I can reason from the effect backwards towards the first cause. From every effect, the existence of its proper cause can be demonstrated. Why? Because since every effect depends upon its cause. If the effect exists, I exist, the cause must pre-exist. So my existence is evidence that there must be a pre-existent cause, and that is God. Hence, the existence of God, insofar as it is not self-evident to us, can be demonstrated from those of his effects, which are known to us. We don't have access to the cause, God himself. He is far beyond us, he transcends us, he is ineffable. But we can reason to the proposition that God exists by starting in the effect, and that is more accessible to us. Returning then only to objection 1, how does Aquinas reply? The existence of God and other like truths about God, which can be known by natural reason, are not articles of faith. Okay, so they don't belong directly to faith. They belong, rather, to the preambles of faith, but are preambles to the articles. For faith presupposes natural knowledge. So the idea that God exists, belongs to natural knowledge. He is confident in reason. This power that God has endowed human beings with, having created human beings in his image and likeness. God has given us the powers of reason, and by reason we can come to know that God exists. Okay? There's more to know about God, such as he is Trinitarian, he is forgiving, he is loving, but that requires, at least the Trinity, requires revelation. But the knowledge of God's existence does not. Nevertheless, he says, there is nothing to prevent man who cannot grasp a proof from accepting as a matter of faith something which in itself is capable of scientifically known and demonstrated. So if you say, but I believe God exists because it's part of my faith, he's saying, nevertheless, that's fine if you come to embrace the knowledge of God's existence through faith, because I grew up and at 2 years of age, I was doing the sign of the cross and saying, dear Jesus, dear God, I believe in God. I didn't reason my way there, but I took it on faith. He says, yes, that is very common, but in its very essence, one can reason towards it, towards the reality of God's existence. Okay? So you can know it by faith, or you can know it by reason alone. That leads us to Article 3, and here we get into the climax of his argument. So having laid out that, first, the proposition itself is not self-evident, it's not obvious, that leads to Article 2, the necessity of demonstration, and in his respondio, the demonstration distinguishes between two kinds of demonstrations, from cause and from effect. From cause, we can't demonstrate God's existence starting in his very being, because that's beyond our access, but we can demonstrate God's existence starting in the effects of God. Now, this is one great difference between Aquinas and Anselm, right? Aquinas will look at the world around him, he will start in the effects, versus what is Anselm trying to do with his ontological argument? Ontology has to do with being. Anselm wants to start in the very being of God. And Aquinas is more accurate in saying, actually, you can't do that. What Anselm is actually doing is he's starting with a mental conception of God and positing, he's making a leap, a jump, to posit the existence of God, but that is a logical fallacy. He's made a jump that's not substantiated. How does Aquinas prove that God exists? He actually gives us 5 proofs, and they are found in the 3rd article. Let's go to Article 3.